today's side quest I picked up the ZigBee adapter, which is pretty versatile. It can be used as a coordinator to help create and manage a ZigBee network, or it can be used as a router to help extend the range of your ZigBee network. It even supports Matter over Thread and a Bluetooth proxy. But the main reason I chose this device is because I can create and manage a ZigBee network, I can connect it to Home Assistant, and it's PoE powered. Pretty cool, if you ask me. While I know that this device has many more capabilities, I feel like this is like a magic wand or something, or I'm conducting. My focus today is using it with my ZigBee devices, connecting it to Home Assistant, and leveraging MQTT and Zigbee2MQTT to help manage and update the firmware of my ZigBee devices. Now, if you're not familiar with MQTT or Zigbee to MQTT, don't worry. We're going to take this step by step and talk about all of the pieces involved so that you can create your own ZigBee network without using a hub and manage it all through Home Assistant. Once it's in Home Assistant, I'll show you how to manage your ZigBee devices, even add some new ones, and even update the firmware for this device directly through Home Assistant. Pretty awesome. First, about this device, this is the SMLIGHT SLZB-06, and this device comes in a lot of different flavors, but I chose this specific model because it supports PoE. It also supports some pretty cool stuff, like it has a USB adapter, not just to power it, but also to use it as a USB device, which is pretty cool. So you have a lot of options. You can power and connect to this over PoE. You can power and connect to it via USB, and you could also power it one of the either ways and connect to it via Wi-Fi and manage it that way. So this device is pretty powerful. It has a lot of great hardware features and a lot of great software features that we'll talk about. So as you can see on their homepage, you can choose between LAN, USB, or Wi-Fi. It has PoE support. It works with Home Assistant, ZHA, and Zigbee2MQTT. We'll talk about the differences between those two. And you can modify the antenna gain, it's small, and some other features you could read about here. And if you want to see more features and specs about this device, they have it all listed in their product documentation on their website. And setting this up is pretty easy too. I'm using a PoE switch, so I plug it in the PoE switch. A few moments later, it'll have an IP address and I can connect to the dashboard. Now the dashboard is going to show you some general information about the device, but let's go into mode and configure this device. Once we visit the mode section, you can choose which mode you want your device to be in. Do you want it to be in coordinator mode, router mode, Matter over Thread mode, and even enable Bluetooth proxy if you want. I want to set mine to coordinator mode, which means I'm going to create and manage a brand new ZigBee network. If we already had a ZigBee network and we wanted this to be a repeater, we could set it into router mode. This confused me at first because I didn't know what a router was and what a coordinator was. I knew what an end device was, but this chart helps explain that. Now, coordinator, you can only have one per network, and this manages the entire network. Router is a way to extend that network to other devices, and it connects back to the coordinator. And then you have end devices, which are the ZigBee devices that we're going to connect, that can connect to a router, but also to a coordinator. So those are just called end devices or devices. So one coordinator, many routers, and many devices. Routers can connect to coordinators, and devices can connect to coordinators. And this is how you build a really big mesh network. So I'm going to leave mine on coordinator. You might need to switch yours. And when you do switch yours, it's going to reflash this device with a firmware appropriate for that role or that mode you're going to put it in. Then we have connection mode. Are we going to connect via Ethernet? Are we going to connect via Wi-Fi? Or are we going to connect it as a USB device, which is pretty awesome. Because I'm using PoE, I'm going to use an Ethernet connection. And network settings are just that, network settings. I'm using Ethernet, so I'm setting mine to DHCP, and then I have a reservation in my DHCP scope specifically for this device. But if you're going to use Wi-Fi or something else, you would configure that here. Z2M and ZHA, this might be a little bit confusing because it was to me when I started. Now, this is just showing us configuration for both ZHA and Z2M, so we don't need to do anything here. This is just showing us how to configure it for those different types of configurations. But the difference between ZHA and Z2M isn't really apparent if you've never done this before. Now you can manage your ZigBee network directly with ZHA or ZigBee Home Automation, which means Home Assistant will own this network, own the devices, and you'll manage them just in Home Assistant. Or you can use ZigBee to MQTT and allow that to manage your network and then integrate it with Home Assistant using the MQTT integration. So the first thing you're probably wondering is, what is MQTT? Well, MQTT is a protocol that allows devices to subscribe and publish messages on a bus. So basically a message bus. If you've ever used anything like Kafka, it's kind of the same idea, but a lot lighter weight. And because MQTT is just a protocol, you need a service that implements that protocol, and that's, for us, going to be Mosquitto. So why would we use MQTT along with ZigBee to manage our devices or kind of be the backbone for communication? Well, it's fast, it's lightweight, and it integrates with a lot of other things. And it uses a pub-sub model. So for example, our MQTT broker, it's going to be Mosquitto in our case, manages the communication between these devices. In this example, let's say we created a topic called temperature. And a topic is something that clients can either subscribe to or publish messages to. And in this example, we have a temp topic, which this valve is subscribed to. You can see it's subscribed to temp. And anytime this thermometer, in this case, has a change, it will publish the change or the temperature to this topic. And then everyone who is subscribed to this topic will get that event. And you can see that this cloud server isn't subscribed to that topic, so it won't get the event. But anyone who is subscribed to that topic will get that event. Basically, what I'm describing is a message bus. And a message bus is great for events. So if you think of all of our ZigBee devices, they're going to be publishing events as things change, and this is a perfect way to do it. Okay, that's great. So we have a broker and a message bus. How does ZigBee fit in? Well, ZigBee fits in with Zigbee2MQTT, or also known as Z2M. And so Z2M uses MQTT to publish events about the devices in your ZigBee network. And so I like to think of Z2M as just a hub. I have my antenna and I have this software, Zigbee2MQTT, and together those create a hub to manage my devices. So it has its own UI. You can see lots of information about your devices, and you can even update firmware over the air with this. So it's really awesome, and you could do a ton of stuff with it. Another reason why some people choose this over ZHA is because it really has nothing to do with Home Assistant at all. You can create your own ZigBee network and manage all of those devices without Home Assistant. It's just that Home Assistant has a plugin that allows you to connect all of the devices then to Home Assistant. So if you're ever going to leave Home Assistant and you were using ZHA, you would have to recreate that network in something else. Not that we're ever going to leave Home Assistant, but if we did and we were using Z2M, that's totally portable and we could use it with the next thing or standalone by itself. So that's why a lot of people choose to go this route, because it kind of separates your concerns. Don't worry, we'll get it configured so we manage everything in Home Assistant, and this will just be there for additional information if we want. Next, in security, this is where we'll configure our username and password. I think by default it's off, so you'll want to set one and then turn it on. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a self-signed certificate, which isn't good. I wish it did so that I wouldn't have to pass my password in clear text over to my IoT network, so I wouldn't make it anything that's shared. Obviously, you shouldn't do that with passwords anyways. Just keep that in mind, because I am putting this on my IoT network. Then we have VPN, and in here we can configure a WireGuard client, which is pretty awesome. If you want to set this device up on another network, say your shop or your vacation home or even your parents' house, and you want to manage it using your instance of Home Assistant, you totally could. Configure WireGuard, have it connect back to your system, and then manage it that way, since you can only have one instance of Home Assistant. Lot of possibilities here, and it's pretty awesome that it has WireGuard. And then settings and tools and general settings. This is where you would set the name of the device or restart any of the services or the device itself. And then in the firmware update section, this is pretty cool. You can update this device over the air. So you can update the core firmware for the device if you want. You could check for updates and then flash it if you have an update. Or you can update the ZigBee piece over the air too. Now you might want to pay attention to which firmware you're going to flash it with, because as you can see here, we have firmware for both a ZigBee router and a ZigBee coordinator, and they're kind of mixed up. I wish there was a toggle to filter, but anyways, just be careful and choose the right one. And so since I'm in a coordinator mode or a coordinator role, this is the one I would choose, and that seems to align with the version that I have, so I don't need to update it. Not a a huge deal. If you accidentally pick router, let it flash. Once it's done, revert it back, and then flash it again. But awesome that we can flash all of this right from this device. And then if you want to schedule it, you can here if you'd like. And then in LED settings, we can control LEDs. In time settings, we can choose which time server we want to point to, as well as the time zone. And then in system log is where you can see the logs for this device. So this device has a ton of capabilities and has a great web UI to manage all of these capabilities. Not to mention, you can update the firmware for both the core and the mode over the air, which is fantastic. So how do we configure these two services, connect our adapter, and then integrate them into Home Assistant? Very carefully. It's pretty easy. I just wanted to use that. Well, Zigbee2MQTT has a lot of documentation on this, and they even have a Docker Compose config that I use for the most part. And if we look at their configuration, it's as simple as creating two services with a couple of things mapped to those two services, and then you have Z2M. And so here's what it looks like in the real world with my Home Assistant stack. So I have a Home Assistant stack where I'm doing some AI stuff, some voice stuff, but then you can also see that I've added MQTT. So I've added this service, I've added a container name, and I'm adding a Docker network called Traffic. So I use Traffic as my reverse proxy. If you don't use Traffic, don't worry. I'll have an example that doesn't have Traffic or Watchtower mixed in my documentation. And you can find that below. But we're setting some environment variables, and then we're using the Mosquitto image. Remember, that's the implementation of MQTT that we want to use that Z2M requires. So we're creating an instance of MQTT or Mosquitto, mapping some volumes. I do have label for Watchtower because I want to live on the edge, and I'm double living on the edge because I'm also pointing the latest. And then you can see I'm running a command as soon as it starts up, and this is what they say to do in the documentation, but basically no authentication for the service. You should probably add that. And then I've commented out ports both for MQTT as well as Zigbee to MQTT. So rather than expose ports on the host, I'm just going to go through Docker networking, and as long as I use the same Docker name, they can all refer to each other then by the service name. It's a little bit advanced, but it works great. And again, you don't need to do that. The example that I have in my documentation won't have that. But then I'm also creating this Z2M or Zigbee2MQTT service. And I'm naming the container, and then I'm using Mac VLAN as a network. Again, pretty advanced, but I'm using the Mac VLAN network driver to create an IP address just for this container. And I do that because this is going to be on my IoT network. Again, that's pretty advanced. You don't need to do that, but here's how you do it if you wanted to. And then I'm saying, hey, also connect to the traffic network. We have some environment variables. We have a restart policy. And then I have lots of labels for both traffic and for Watchtower that you don't need. And then I have the image of MQTT right here, and then mapping some volumes as well. Now you might notice that I've commented out devices and they have it in their example, but you really don't need this if you're connecting over the network. You only need this if you're going to use this adapter as a USB device. And this is how you map the USB device to that container. We don't need it, so we're going to comment it out. And then one more thing to make note of is in between these two code blocks, they say, hey, start with this configuration file. And if we go to this configuration file, you can see a minimal configuration. So here's their example. Permit join is true. We're going to set this to false and we'll manually toggle it on. We're pointing to the MQTT server. And since they're exposing the ports on the local host, they're going to say local host. And then they're setting serial. We'll change this in our example. And then they're setting the front end. So let's look at my example, which is more tailored to the devices that we're using. So if you look at my configuration, we're saying use Home Assistant true, and this exposes some information so we can use it with Home Assistant. We're saying permit join is false, and we're setting this to false because we don't want to automatically discover and adopt devices when we find them. We want to do that manually, and by manually, I mean we're just going to allow them to join for a few minutes and then turn it back off. So this way, it's not adding devices that you may or may not want on your network and exposing your network key. Then we're setting MQTT, the base topic. Again, this is the topic that all of these devices are going to subscribe to. I'm just going to name it Zigbee2MQTT. It can be anything, doesn't really matter, but I'm going to name it this topic right here. Then we're setting the server. So the protocol it's going to use is MQTT, and then it's going to look at the host name for MQTT and the port. Now, if you remember in their example, they're using localhost. But I'm not going to use localhost because I'm using Docker networking. And because I'm using Docker networking, I can refer to these services by name. So you can see here, my service name is MQTT. And if we look here, my service name is also MQTT. Now for the serial port, we're going to map that to the IP address of the ZigBee adapter that we're using. And this is the IP address that you'll want to get that we used earlier to get to the dashboard. So we're saying the protocol is TCP. We're connecting to this IP address, and the port is going to be 6638. And then for front end, I'm telling Z2M what our port is to get to the UI. And then you might see the keys here, so PAN ID, EXT ID, and some devices I already have joined. When you first create this, you won't have this. These keys will be supplied. A quick tip, if you need to regenerate those keys, like I've had to do in the past, you would just set the key value to generate. So for example, if you needed to reset all of these keys, you would basically delete all of these in a list. You would delete this, and then you would set the key value to generate, and you need a space. And you would recreate this container, and it would generate those keys for you. I only mention that because it took me a while to figure that out when I needed to reset my keys while testing this. But you don't want to reset your keys later, or your devices won't be able to connect to the network, so only do this if you really need to reset your keys. So once we have everything set, then you can start your stack or restart your stack if you're adding it to an existing one. So I'm going to do a Docker Compose restart. This will restart my stack. It will pull down the additional images and configure those containers. Now remember, earlier I said that Z2M also has a UI, so let's check out the UI. So if we go to ZigBee to MQTT, the UI, and that should be, I think, on port 8080 if you're not using traffic and you don't have it configured, you'll see that we can see a dashboard of all of our devices. Now, these devices I've added already, but we'll add a new one here in a second. But again, we can see the device. We can see a lot of information about this device, which is really awesome. And then you'll see a lot of settings and other settings and states and clusters. So a lot of information that I haven't had to use, and hopefully I never do, but it's there if you need it. And it goes to show that this UI has a lot more information about your devices than Home Assistant does. But you can see I have my devices, Z1, Z2, and Z3. These are 3 of these plugs that I've already added. And if we go into dashboard, I can toggle these plugs on, off, no problem at all. And you might notice that these devices also show the power usage, which is pretty cool. And we can actually map these devices too. If we click on load map, it's going to build a map of our ZigBee network. Now, mine's pretty small, but you can see here is the coordinator. Again, it's the one device we have. It's, in this case, this ZigBee to MQTT. And you can see that these end devices all connect back to the coordinator, through the antenna, of course. You can see that they also connect to each other, but their strongest path is right here. So Z2, Z1, and Z3 connect directly to the coordinator. But for some reason, if we move this device physically further away, then this device could go through Z1 to get back to the coordinator. So really cool. This is why I like ZigBee and mesh networking. There are other settings here, but I wanted to touch on OTA. So OTA is over-the-air updates, so we can update the firmware on these devices through the ZigBee network, which is really cool. Now I can check for devices and it says no update is available, but if we had one, we could update the firmware for here. Now you might see this permit to join. This is why we set it to false, so that it doesn't start up with allowing devices to join. We have to actually allow them to join, and we'll get a 4.5-minute countdown to let those devices join, and I just let one join, and then they'll be added to our network. So cool, that means that this device was joined to our network. Let's disable the join now. Now we can check for firmware updates. This one doesn't have any, so we won't see any. But instead of managing them through here, we really want to manage them inside of Home Assistant. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm glad we have this UI and it's great to dive deeper into some of these devices, but I want to manage everything in Home Assistant. So really, this is going to become an interface to all of my ZigBee devices, and I'll still manage everything through Home Assistant. So let's get it configured with Home Assistant. So in Home Assistant, we'll want to add an integration, and we'll want to look for MQTT. We'll choose MQTT, and we'll choose MQTT again. So now it's asking for our broker. So what is our broker? Well, again, it's MQTT, right? Not ZigBee to MQTT, but it's actually MQTT. And it's asking for the hostname or IP address for the broker. Now, again, if you've done this through localhost, you want to put in localhost or the IP address if you're exposing the ports on the node. But for me, it's MQTT because again, I want to refer to it by service name on the internal Docker network. Then you want to set the port as 1883 by default, so I'm not going to change that. And then if you have a username and password on this broker, you should probably have one. I don't. You can put it there if you need. So let's submit. And it just discovered our devices, and now it's asking us to add these devices to Home Assistant. And we can see we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 devices, but I only have 4 plugs. That's because this Zigbee to MQTT or Z to M is considered a bridge. So it's basically a hub, and Home Assistant is seeing this as a hub. Now you can set the location of these devices. I'm not going to, but if we go into MQTT and drill into one of these devices, we can see that we can power these devices on and off. So toggle it on, toggle it off, and I can do this for any of these devices here. We look at Z3, we can also see that I have some energy usage there, and it's appearing here on a chart, which is pretty cool. And so these have energy monitoring, so I can monitor that as well. If I wanted to look at the history over time, I could, and we can see many attributes about this. So it's pretty awesome, pretty powerful for this small, cheap device. Pretty affordable. Cool, but I mentioned we wanted to add devices in Home Assistant as well. So how would we add a new Zigbee device, say if we wanted to discover it? Well, first you would put that Zigbee device in pairing mode. Once it's in pairing mode, you would go to your bridge and you would toggle on permit join. This is doing the same thing that we were just doing here, clicking permit join, but we're doing it inside of Home Assistant. So let's permit join. If we go back to our Z to M UI, you can see that these are in sync. And then we should see here in Home Assistant that, hey, we found a new device. So it found this new device. I added another plug and I put it in pairing mode. And if we look at this new device, you can see that an update is available for it. So we can update the firmware of this device right from Home Assistant. So it has version 268.51.3352 on it. And the latest firmware that Home Assistant can find is 268.51.3360. So we can install it right from here. So let's do that. Now this is going to take some time to do because Zigbee networks are really slow. I'm talking about like in the kilobits. So it might take 5 or 6 or 7 minutes to update this one device. So if you have a lot of devices that need to update their firmware at the same time, I would probably do 1 or 2 just so you don't knock some of the other devices offline. And I wish Home Assistant would show the status, but I haven't found a way to find it there. What I typically do is go back into Z to M if I want to see how far along this is of the progress. And if we go back to Z to M, we can see right here that this is going to take about 9 minutes. So it's at 14%. So while that is updating, I should probably go back in and disable auto joining of devices, even though it will after 5 minutes. I'm just going to toggle it off now. So no one is able to join now unless I turn that back on. And let's wait for the firmware to finish. So after that's done updating, one thing you might notice is that the device name is a little bit weird. So I think this is the serial number or something from that device. And while I could update it here in Home Assistant, I think it's better to update it in Z to M. The reason being is that Z to M is upstream of Home Assistant, so I'd rather rename it upstream and let that change trickle down to Home Assistant. Think of it like my hub. Would I rename it in Home Assistant and not rename it in my hub and then have a discrepancy between the two devices? No, I'd most likely go into my hub, rename it, and let that trickle down to Home Assistant. You could do it either way, but that's how I'm going to manage it because it makes things a little bit easier. So if we go back into Z to M, we go to this device, should be as simple as just renaming it to Z5, and I'm going to tell it to update Home Assistant. And if we go back into Home Assistant, it's already renamed. So pretty cool. You can see all my devices now have the proper name. A couple of weeks ago, I had no idea what the difference was between a coordinator and a router, what Z to M was, and what MQTT was even used for within Home Assistant. But as you can see, we figured it out. And the little adapter that I picked up is a pretty awesome way to learn about all of this, as well as create your own Zigbee network with Home Assistant. If you have questions, post them in the comments below. I'm Tim. Thanks for watching.